introductions, we will move on to the hearing of Senate Bill 258. Jason, if you want to give us an overview of the bill.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. Senate Bill 258 amends an election crime statute 25-2438. This was an election crime that was first enacted back in, I believe, 2021. Currently, it's a severity level 7 non-person felony to represent oneself as an election official, to engage in conduct that gives the appearance of being an election official, or engage in conduct that would cause another person to believe such person is an election official. This statute has been litigated over the last several years, and the second and third elements there in the statute have actually been enjoined by the court and are not currently enforceable due to the court rulings on those elements. Senate Bill 258 looks to amend those provisions to address the concerns put forth by the court. It strikes element 2 altogether, so that engaging in conduct that gives the appearance of being an election official would be removed from the statute altogether, and then addresses element number 3 to insert a specific intent provision into there, so that the person engaged in the conduct has to do so with the intent to cause another person to believe that they are an election official. And then it also amends the first element, the representing oneself as an election official, just to add some clarity on including the use of official seals or other insignia of the Secretary of State or a county election office as an example of representing oneself as an election official. The criminal penalty does remain the same at a level 7 non-person felony. These changes would be effective July 1st if enacted. I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Any questions for Jason? Seeing none, you did a really great job. If you look to our agenda for opposition testimony, we have written only by Davis Hammett. And then we have neutral testimony, and we have one in person, Clay Barker, Deputy Secretary of State. So, Clay, welcome to committee.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. And the Secretary of State is a proponent for this bill. So, as Jason said, the original bill to criminalize impersonating an election official was adopted by the legislature in 2021. So I'm not going to go back over the reasons for that, but essentially I believe it was targeting two things. Is one, a person who impersonates an election official to gather data, and a second type is the person that impersonates an election official to actually go defraud people. Say, I'm here to help you get your registration, give me your social security number, your mother's maiden name, and they take the data and take off. So what I'm going to focus my testimony on is just the changes to this statute, since the legislature's already had its opinion that it wants this. Immediately after this bill was enacted in 2021, and it was S-sub for House Bill 2183, there was litigation brought, and I won't go through all the twists and turns of that. There were several different issues in there. It's gone on for 4 years. And in December of this year, the state government, the Attorney General, agreed to permanently enjoin attempting to enforce this particular version of the statute after the Supreme Court issued its opinion of May 2024, which called it into question. And the Supreme Court went on for quite a while about why it felt this was a violation of the First Amendment, that its language was too broad, and gave some hints about, well, we read it as hints about how to fix it so it would be acceptable to the court. We had our litigation attorneys who have been battling this for 5 years now, and they have heard judges at every level, district, appellate, Supreme Court, all the arguments by the other side, and they believe the language in the bill they're very supportive of it. They think it's going to work. They've suggested, and I've given this to the reviser, just a small change of moving some of the language in the bill to a different section and adding in just a few words, and they think that would be sufficient to overcome any litigation challenging the statute. And I take their word for it because they've been the ones in the trenches battling this for 5 years. I I trust their judgment on what would satisfy the court. And with that, Madam Vice Chair, I'll stand for questions.
Thank you, and thank you for correcting that you are a proponent. Are there any questions? Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you so much, Clay. I kind of dropped the ball on this. I know I introduced the bill, and I definitely would be testifying as a proponent. I appreciate all your work and all the history on it, and Jason's work. I know we've had this a few years. It passed the Senate, and they threw some stuff in with the House, and then we had some issues with lawsuits. But I can't tell you how much I appreciate your guys' work, and hopefully we can get this done, because we don't need individuals trying to imitate our elected officials or authorities. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Senator Fasquedo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Senator Tyson's comment made me ask. So I agree with the majority of the comments. But what did we do in the previous legislation that was passed to address the concern from the League of Women Voters, who bipartisan group who would register people to vote, and then they were a little afraid actually to register people to a vote and not look like they were official? Did we address that in current law? Thank you.
Senator, I believe the current wording, what's in this bill, addresses their concern, and I'll try to explain the Supreme Court's opinion. It went on for, I think, 60, 70 pages, so I'm going to give you the short version. But the way the bill was written is it used the word knowingly, and the Supreme Court considered that if I were to talk to this group, and I do not intend to fool anybody, but I know that one of you will misunderstand what I say, that could be interpreted as knowingly. It's how you would receive my words. And by changing it to intent, it means I have to intend to fool you, which is a different standard. And the Supreme Court, in its opinion, said as long as, essentially, if the word intent or intend is in there, then that changes the focus of the prohibition. And I believe that would satisfy the individuals that were challenging this. I can't speak for them, but.
Further questions? Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I hope our intent on the bill, the legislation, was never the League of Women Voters. It was a bad player, just so the committee knows. There was a developer that they've developed a website, and it looks official. It looks like the Secretary of State's website. And so individuals are going out there and registering to vote. And what's happening is they're taking their data, they're putting trackers on their machine, cookies and other software, and then they are forwarding that information to the Secretary of State. So you never knew you were on a bad player's website. That's what started this. And then we got all those letters that had the state seal on it, implying that they were the Secretary of State's office. And so it just made sense to say, tell who you are. Don't try to imitate that you are somebody you're not. Thank you.
Further questions? Senator Francisco.
Thank you. And Mr. Barker, thank you for being here. So can you define for me, and it says is used in the section election official, means the Secretary of State or employee thereof. So I got a little seal from our county clerk that, or a pin that had the seal when we were working the polls. So I'm assuming that if I were volunteering to work the polls, I wouldn't be an employee. So how would that person then be either inside of or not inside of this definition of election official?
I believe in that case, Senator, you would be considered, even if you're a volunteer employee, because you're an agent for the county election officer when you're working polls. But the focus, the center of gravity of this bill is someone who falsely portrays themselves as an election worker that intend to fool someone else. So you don't have a connection. You're not a poll worker. You're not working for the county election office, but you somehow imply that you are. And that is your intent to fool someone. And proving intent is a little harder than showing that the result of what you did fooled somebody.
Thank you. I just asked because I am trying to have people believe that I'm an election official when I'm working at the polls. But I do know that, I'm just was questioning the question of employment. And I may talk later to the revisor about that.
Senator Gossage.
I too have worked the polls and been a poll judge, and I know the little pin that the senator's talking about, but I just want to make sure, if I may, Madam Chair, ask the question that it seems to me like here's the line in the sand. If you're wearing it when you're working the polls, you are an election official. But if you were to keep that and wear it out somewhere or knock on doors and say, you know, and that people just see that and think that you are an election official or you're collecting ballots as an election official or whatever, that I would think would be a proof of intent because you don't wear that except when you're working the polls. Does that make sense?
Yes, Senator, and again, this is a criminal statute, so you'd have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt that you intended to fool someone. It's not that you forgot to take it off and something along those lines.
Further questions for Clay? Seeing none, thank you very much, Clay, for being here. We will close the hearing on SB 258, and now we will open the hearing on SB 234. And Jason, if you want to give us an overview.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. Senate Bill 234 would create a new statute that prohibits the use of genetic sequencers or software used for genetic analysis that is produced by a foreign adversary or a company that is owned or domiciled in a foreign adversary. The bill defines foreign adversary to mean China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, the Maduro regime, and Venezuela and Syria. Any sequencers or software that is prohibited by the bill must be replaced. Any medical or research facility may request reimbursement for replacement costs subject to appropriations that are made for such reimbursements, and those requests must be submitted by October 1st of 2025. And that would be reimbursement from the state treasurer. These provisions would go into effect on July 1st of this year, and I will just at the outset say that I got my degree in law, not biology or bioengineering or geneticists or anything like that. And so I'll defer any technical questions on the software and technology we're talking about here to the proponents.
All right, thank you, Jason. Questions, Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I do have a legal question, Jason. So when we did the foreign adversary for the Capers investments and other financial, we did not specifically spell out the countries. We referred to a list that is kept by the federal government. Would that be an option for this bill instead of spelling it out? I'm afraid by spelling it out, we may need to add or subtract from the list.
Well, and Madam Chair, members of the committee, we ran into this issue with other legislation on trying to identify foreign adversaries. You can reference, there is a federal regulation you can reference. When we reference federal law, however, it's at that fixed moment in time when the statute goes into effect. And so again, you still don't have the flexibility to add to, remove from that list unless you delegate some type of regulatory authority. In other bills, it's been to, say, the Attorney General to add or subtract from that list by rule and reg authority. And so while that is another option, I don't know if it provides you the flexibility as opposed to naming the foreign adversaries in the bill specifically.
Further questions for Jason? Seeing none, thank you very much, Jason. We have two proponents. They both are on WebEx. So the first one is Jackie Deal. Jackie, are you there?
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify. My name is Jackie Deal. I'm actually in Washington, D.C. right now, and I'm on the advisory board of State Armor, a nonprofit that was started about a year ago to combat subnational or foreign threats at the subnational or U.S. state level. I've spent my career researching the Chinese military, and that's why I wanted to testify today. Over a couple decades of trying to understand better the People's Republic of China's buildup, I've learned about the Chinese Communist Party's interest in biowarfare, which actually dates back at least to the Korean War, when Chinese propagandists falsely accused American soldiers of using bioweapons on the battlefield. More recently, in 2015, a Chinese colonel and a professor at one of China's military command colleges wrote a book accusing the United States of having developed a genetically modified bedbug as a bioweapon. In 2016, a Chinese general, the head of actually China's National Defense University at the time, also published a different book stating, quote, "In the development of biotechnology today, the most lethal weapons are genetically engineered weapons designed to attack people based on their specific ethnic or racial background, causing specific races to become ill, such as suffering immune deficiency, loss of intelligence, sterilization, or even death, while leaving other races unscathed." So accordingly, senior Chinese military officers have been writing about the need to establish what they call biological dominance or biological deterrence, meaning that they must demonstrate the ability to use genetic manipulation techniques like CRISPR that have been pioneered in the medical space for military purposes so that other countries will fear China. To achieve this end, the Chinese Communist Party has sponsored the rise of a company called Beijing Genomics Institute, or BGI, which makes genetic sequencing machines and also performs sequencing services. BGI is known to have been working with the Chinese military to study the genomes of fetuses in other countries since 2010. More recently, it has been engaged with foreign scientists and scientists in China to make soldiers more resistant to altitude sickness and other forms of personal enhancement for soldiers. So in other words, they are trying to use genetic advances and advances in genetic understanding for military purposes. The Chinese Communist Party subsidizes BGI, and the funding that BGI gets from Chinese state-owned banks enables it to underprice foreign competitors to do the sequencing or to build the sequencing machines. The Chinese funds from the Chinese government also allow BGI to buy up foreign competitors, including in the United States. So here in the US, BGI has many affiliates or subsidiaries, including MGI, Complete Genomics, Inomics, and Stomix, according to the US House Committee on the Competition with the Chinese Communist Party. Also, unfortunately, hospitals across the United States, including in Kansas, use sequencers from these companies and contract with them for sequencing services, meaning that Americans' genetic data goes to China, where it is believed that they are actually stored on servers from the telecommunications company Huawei, which was linked to the Chinese military, and that's why the first Trump administration tried to ban their operation in the United States. So the US government, the federal government, has put BGI and several of its affiliates or subsidiaries on federal sanctions lists, such as the Commerce Department's entity lists, because of the company's complicity in the genocide happening in Western China. And also, it has been put on the 1260H list of the Pentagon, meaning that the US military and its contractors are not supposed to do business with BGI. But these designations, unfortunately, don't prevent the states or local governments or hospitals from purchasing BGI machines or services. The Congress has been working on legislation that is actually passed in different forms, both the House and the Senate, but it hasn't been reconciled. It didn't quite make it past the finish line last year. Meanwhile, PGI machines, again, continue to operate and PGI services continue to be done in our hospitals across the United States. So that's why I think Kansas has a real opportunity here to act to protect their residents by banning the use of hostile foreign adversary genetic sequencers and software. Thanks.
Committee, since we have two WebEx conferees, I'll ask now, anybody have any questions for Jackie? Senator Falcado.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, ma'am, for your presentation. You intrigued me and got my attention. Did you say that what this bill would do is trying to prevent the more superior race?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Senator. The issue is that Chinese are subsidizing or funding this company to collect genetic information all over the world because they think their military should use it to make bioweapons that are tailored to hurt certain races while sparing, for instance, Chinese people. So in effect, if that worked, we could have a situation where Chinese people survive in a war that involves bioweapons and people of other ethnic or racial backgrounds don't. So thank you for the question.
Further questions for Jackie? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair, and thank you for your testimony. Do you know if any hospitals in Kansas, and I would particularly look to the research that's going on probably at the University of Kansas Medical Center, do you know if they use any of these sequencers?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair and Senator. I can look into that for you. I will take that back as a research question, but my belief is yes, because while there are American and other allied countries that provide machines, or there are companies in the US and other countries that make these machines and perform these services, the Chinese have been trying to ramp up BGI very quickly, again, through these subsidies. And they had some legal hurdles because there were lawsuits outstanding against them for involving intellectual property disputes with American companies that accused them of stealing their technology. But that all got resolved, I think, last year or the year before. So they've been trying aggressively to promote the use of their machines and their services across the country. So I would reckon that it's likely that, as you said, the University of Kansas Medical Center either does business with BGI through sequencing or through the machines or through one of its subsidiaries or affiliates in the United States, such as MGI. But I can check on that and get back to you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I would very much appreciate that. And if the information could be sent to the committee assistant, then it could be distributed to the committee.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
Further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much, Jackie. Next, we will go to Michael Lucy. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Madam Chair, Lucci.
Okay. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, members of the committee, for this opportunity to testify before you. I'll explain, I'll kind of build upon what Jackie was explaining with a few references to both Chinese law and then American regulations that I think play a role here. At a high level, all Chinese companies, including Beijing Genomics and its subsidiaries, are subject to China's 2017 National Intelligence Law. This law, as described by both the Trump and Biden administrations, requires all Chinese companies to turn over any data they collect to the government in Beijing for use in whatever way that the government in Beijing would want to use it. As Jackie mentioned, Beijing Genomics has been blacklisted by the Department of Defense for working with China's military in developing weapons that are based on, that have a genetic basis. They're also sanctioned by the Department of Commerce for really for their involvement in human rights abuses. So they collect genetic data of folks in Western China. There's minority groups in Western China. They're collecting their genetic data for surveillance minimally and possibly for biomedical abuses against those people. The concept that China would build upon here, there are two concepts. One's called military civil fusion, military civil fusion means they, on the Chinese side, they identify technologies that they think are important for military use that also have civilian application. That's what the genetic sequencing technology, that falls in that category. I believe I had distributed to the committee a letter from the chair and vice chair of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party to to Gina Raimondo, who was then the head of the Department of Commerce, where they described this. So this is kind of a bipartisan concern. They described their concerns with Beijing Genomics and their subsidiaries. That letter is dated January 9th of this year. So the concept is this civil military fusion where China identifies these technologies that have that dual use, military and civilian use. They want to dominate those technologies. The first step is to what they say is indigenize, which means get that technology, all the intellectual property involved with it in China and the production of that technology in China. And then that step two is called just sort of brute force economics. And what that means is they will then subsidize that technology to dominate world markets. So in some examples, in some technologies, and also in things like steel, they'll produce 120% of what the world needs. So if the world needs 100 units of steel, they'll produce 120 just so nobody else exists in that field. And so we should assume that that would be the play in this biotech field. We've seen it in drones. Kansas, like candidly every state in the United States, is dependent upon drones from China, DJI drones. That was a successful example of civilian military fusion strategy that they do. Not Kansas themselves, but telecommunications companies became dependent on Huawei radio transponders, 5G technology, because they indigenized that technology, then they wiped out all competitors. As Jackie mentioned, when China's leaders talk about using this for genetically targeted weapons, we should take them very seriously. Now, the federal government has raised the alarm. The federal government has done these sanctions, blacklists. They're considering legislation. But regardless of what the federal government does, they can't totally solve the issue. A piece of this is left to the states, which speaks to this proposal here, where it would just say state healthcare facilities can't use this. The federal proposal says if you cannot use federal dollars for these services, but it doesn't kind of get rid of the problem completely. States can get rid of the problem completely. I'll close by noting this similar legislation. You know, states are kind of waking up to this problem amongst others. Similar legislation was advanced in or passed in both chambers in Tennessee unanimously Monday of this week. And it also passed on a bipartisan vote from one chamber in Arizona earlier this year. Last year, it was enacted unanimously in the state of Idaho. And I think that you'll see a lot of other states take this up as they are aware of the problem that the federal government has really been highlighting. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Committee questions for Michael. Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. So did the other states put any penalties in their legislation? Because there's, I don't see a penalty in this.
Representative, my understanding is that states will put in a penalty of $5,000 to $10,000 for each infraction. An infraction would be if an individual like myself, you know, is receiving healthcare at a hospital, and that hospital sequences my genome, you know, sequences my nucleotides on a piece of equipment from Beijing Genomics or one of their affiliates or subsidiaries. So that is how they have gotten at that in other states. They also will do a similar penalty for the storage of genomic information in a foreign adversary country, and the foreign adversaries being the same that were discussed earlier in the testimony. So that, you know, regardless of whether the devices are used, we don't want the genomic information being sent there. In that last part about not storing genomic information in a foreign adversary country, that is aligned with an executive order issued by President Biden around this time last year. Maybe it was more towards the summer last year, where he issued an executive order about ensuring that personal information like genomic information would not be transmitted to a foreign adversary country.
Further questions? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. So I'm trying to understand, you know, I guess I understand why you wouldn't want to send material for sequencing, but how would a device that's used for sequencing share information with any of these foreign adversaries? How would that happen?
Representative, the way it would happen is that the company, Beijing Genomics, that produces the devices would be compelled by the Chinese government to turn over that data. So any data that touches a Chinese company is subject to, rendition, so to speak, to China. We've seen this kind of play out in the debate, and really it's an ongoing debate over TikTok, where the CEO of TikTok ends up having to speak out of both sides of his mouth when he testifies before Congress, where he says, "Oh, your information with TikTok is safe." And then he's asked by both Democrats and Republicans who both supported that legislation. He's asked, saying, "Why does it keep ending up in China? Why is it the case that it's stored in China if you keep telling us it's stored actually in Texas?" And so the problem is the 2017 National Intelligence Law that I referred to requires any of these companies, regardless of what American law says about medical privacy and other data privacy, it requires these companies to give that data over to China's government. In this case, it would probably go to the Chinese, the military, the People's Liberation Army. And so really there's just this fundamental incongruence when you have Chinese companies operating in the United States, because their home country requires them to turn over all this data. It doesn't matter what American law says. So the only way to really cut off that data from going to China is to have it not touch their genetic sequencing technologies. And one last thing I'll note, Beijing Genomics is still a minority player in the United States. Illumina, and there are a couple other American, European providers who are bigger. Just a couple weeks ago, China sanctioned the American genomic sequencing companies and said they're not allowed to operate in China anymore. So China recognizes, in their opinion, that this is really a military technology, and they don't want it touching American genomic sequencers for whatever their reasons are. And so I think that we should take them seriously when they basically tell us that they see this as military technology.
Further questions? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. The reason that I asked that was we had a discussion about drones, and drones were identified. But there is no way that the information that the drone is connecting can get, I see some shaking heads, but the device itself doesn't connect to anything. When you talked about TikTok, oh my gosh, yes, TikTok's on the internet. So that information is easily shared. But I would be interested in more information, I think, about state armor action. And do you have any connections with the American operators or producers of these sequencers?
Representative, I'd be happy to answer that question. We don't have any connection in any way to Illumina or any other American companies. To be more expressive on that point, I once reached out to them when we were working on this. So we originally started working on this issue because the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party raised this as a huge problem. I think it was in October of 2023. And so I was just trying to understand the technology at that point. And I reached out to a couple companies in this space, and I actually never got a response from them. So neither are we funded. We actually don't take any contributions. We have two nonprofits. We don't take any contributions from any company because we don't want to even have a perception of a conflict of interest. I don't think that there's anything wrong if some other nonprofit receives money from American companies to sort of push back against Chinese companies. We just don't do that. We're funded by individuals and foundations that have nothing to do with this company or any other. We work on, drone legislation in a similar way, but we're not in any way connected to American drone companies or Europeans in that case. So not only are we don't have an official connection. At the point where I was trying to understand the technology, it's nothing against them. It's just like my emails were bouncing. And so I ended up going to other biotech entrepreneurs who are not in this space, but they understand the technology, and was able to get an explanation from them on basically how this works. So I hope that is sufficient, but happy to discuss that more.
I appreciate knowing that you don't have connections, because that was not necessarily the case when we talked about drones.
Senator Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just for the senator from Douglas, Senator Francisco, with drones, there's a possibility of disabling the drones if you're the creator of the drones. And I think that was a different level of concern, since these are used for law enforcement and the military. Here it's information, and we're all accustomed to even our boxes here storing to the cloud. And these proprietary devices will likely store to somewhere accessed by China. So I think it's the information when you're talking about genetic sequences, rather than the ability of the CCP to disable devices in the event of conflict.
Further questions?
Can I respond to that, since it was sent to me, made to me? I'm just trying to figure out how the information would be transmitted, because just using a piece of a sequencer does not mean, and we have these same discussions with people about elections who think that, the equipment at a polling place is directly connected to the internet, and you can find something. So I'm wondering how that connection works.
Representative, I could probably speak to that a little bit more. So I think that what we are finding actually very rapidly right now is that anything that connects to the internet and comes from China is going to be leaking data. And it's not necessarily obvious at first. So I'll refer to two headlines from our federal government from, I think, 6 weeks ago, from the FDA and from CISA, the cybersecurity agency. And the headline, it just says, Contech contains a backdoor. Contech is the healthcare monitor next to your hospital bed, and it shows vitals, oxygenation, pulse, blood pressure. And what they describe is that all of those devices, and they're sold in the United States broadly, all of those devices are sending data back to China. They're Chinese products. And this was just not known. These products are ubiquitous. It was just not known until about 6 weeks ago, and the federal government flagged it. There's a firmware programming that just sends the data back. And it's not just that it sends the data back in this case, it allows for code to be executed remotely on that device. And so what that means is that if my blood pressure is 120/80, they can make it say 170/140 through remote access to that device. And all of a sudden, my doctor's going to be thinking a very different thing about my situation. There was a headline just last week about literally over 1 billion Bluetooth-enabled devices manufactured by a company in Shanghai. It was just discovered by a Spanish cybersecurity company that they all have a backdoor that's undisclosed that allows access to those devices. Those are going in home appliances all across the United States, Europe, and otherwise. And so over time, we're just repeatedly finding that these technologies from China contain backdoors. Sometimes we find out from the federal government, and even on drones. I'm looking at CISA, the cybersecurity agency. They put out a memo 2 years ago saying if you just connect it to update the software, or if you just connect it to anything for any reason, it could leak data in that instance. So even drones that we might try to secure, the federal government often warns that regardless of what you're trying to do, you're going to have to update it in some way. It'll connect to the internet, and it can leak data in that case.
Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. wrote a research paper in 2006, and data can be transferred across just outlets. They think that there has to be an internet connection, but if there's electricity, there can be data being transferred. One of the, Senator Peterson will give you a great example. There was some thermostats being handed out, and people were buying them low cost. You might not think of that as being nefarious, but those thermostats were actually collecting data. That data was being shipped to one of our foreign adversaries. So it's in places that you don't even think about that it is happening and can be happening. Thank you.
Committee, further questions for the conferee? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here via WebEx. We do not have any neutral or opponent testimony, so I will now close the bill hearing on Senate Bill 234. Committee, we are not meeting tomorrow, but I do want to note that there will be a revision to the agenda that was sent out. We do have a bill hearing on Monday. I do with that sheet of paper. Here it is. It's Senate Bill 146. Also be prepared for doing final actions on bills previously heard on Monday and Tuesday. And I'm just throwing this out there. We have a lot of bills to do, so we may be a little late in committee, but please bear with us so we can get all this done so we can get to the floor. For that, we are adjourned. Thank you.